Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Michelle Blackmer, the Chief Marketing Officer at Lineate, and I'm joined by two of my peers and friends for a recap of ViVe and HIMSS. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves in just a minute, but before I do, a couple housekeeping steps. This is going to be a pretty interactive conversation between the three of us, and we really encourage you to participate too. You're muted, but you can do that through the Q&A panel in the webinar. So if you enter a question, we'll weave it into the dialogue. If somehow we miss your question, we'll follow up with you after the event. And we'll also share a recording of the event within 24 hours. So like I said, recap, very casual. Please send us your questions. And with that, Drew, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. I'm Drew Ivan, the Chief Strategy Officer at Lineate, and I've been around healthcare interoperability for a long time. So this is about my at least 15th HIMSS that I've been to, but my first ViVe though.
And Scott?
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Scott Gilberry. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Lineate, and like Drew, been in healthcare IT for the last couple decades plus. Attended all sorts of different conferences, including HIMSS, and we're kind of excited to just kind of have a nice discussion here today, tell you some of our observations and thoughts coming out of those two events, ViVe and HIMSS.
Awesome. Yeah, you know, Drew and I were doing the math at the show of how many HIMSS events we've been to, and I went to my first event in 2004, and then outside of COVID, missed one other. So we're both like in the 15 to 16 range, and then the first one for ViVe. So this should be, you know, kind of fun, compare and contrast and share what we learned. So I thought first we'd just talk about our perceptions of each of the shows. First, and I should share, you know, Scott, I know you were at ViVe, Drew, you were at both, I attended both. So for the audience, we'll bring those different perspectives. ViVe was first, so let's talk about that one first. I thought that I definitely felt a different vibe, if you will, than I have at other healthcare trade shows. It felt light, it felt fun, and I will save the content for later. So just the, you know, getting there, showing up, I was a little not sure what this is going to be like, but when I walked in, I felt the energy was high and it was going to be a pretty fun event. What about you two?
Yeah, I'm with you, Michelle. You know, showing up at ViVe, there was a real energy that seemed to be there as soon as you arrived. Even leading up to it, I think there's a lot of buzz, and I think they did a great job of you know, creating a fun atmosphere. You know, I like all sorts of different arts, and so for me, seeing all the caricatures, I always find those to be exciting for all the speakers. I also enjoyed in each of the different places where there was panelists and discussions, and these great backdrops with artwork that I thought were just fun to look at. Fun, they're kind of exciting to kind of see what you're going to discover in each of those. And on top of it, I also really liked, you know, I was thinking when we were going to have this discussion, I really enjoyed going to some of the talks, and before the talks would start on the main stage, they would have local musicians play and perform. And I thought that was really fun and exciting. It added, you know, an interesting, like you said, maybe vibe to the event. But I really liked that. I mean, engaging with the local musicians and having them participate, it just added more energy, more energy rather than, you know, you just go into the next session and, you know, go from talk to talk. I found it to be quite exciting.
Yeah, and I think ViVe was put on by a combination of Health and Chime, and you can see the influence of both organizations in ViVe. I've only been to the Health conference once, but I think it was even more so some of the things we're describing here than ViVe was, which reflects a little bit of the influence of Chime, I think. So between the two organizations, I think they found a path in between, you know, right down the middle. I didn't get to go to any of the sessions. I spent most of the time in the exhibit hall, but you know, even that was a high energy place with the booths and the vendors, you know, bringing their best game to the show floor.
You know what I found, Drew, with the sessions, because I actually went to a decent number of sessions on Zara's. There was a really good diversity of speakers that I saw at ViVe. So when you think of all different stakeholders across the healthcare ecosystem were participating. Quite honestly, the ones that you still don't see are, each of us are patients and consumers. You don't see that. You don't see us playing that role as much. I mean, everyone will tell a story that they have, but generally speaking, you have people in public health, you had payers speaking, you had large digital health companies, you had small startups, you had public health agencies. You basically had just a wide diversity of experiences in these discussions. And what I liked about the discussions I saw at ViVe was where they combined so many of these different profiles together into common discussions. And so you could get completely different perspectives on the same topic from from each of those different individuals. So I found the speaking sessions to be quite good. The ones I attended, of course, there's so many I can't speak to all of them, but I went to a good number of them and found them to be really quite good.
I found that on the show floor, like you mentioned, in the interop pavilion area, like two things I found most notable. One, I think in the digital health startup area, there were over 500 startups, and that landed on me of how much, how many applications are facing healthcare organizations today, the options that they have, and seeing that presence. And then in the interop showcase, I liked how there were constantly a stream of conversations going, presentations about CMS rules, TEFCA, FHIR, some of the concepts that are near and dear to us were covered there, as well as in kind of end user sessions that were happening outside of the show floor too. Drew, you were in a CMS panel. Were you hearing much about CMS and TEFCA during ViVe or HIMSS?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously on everybody's mind, and there's at this point, I don't think there's a lot of confusion about what's going on with those rules, but I think there's uncertainty about like what the implications will be. Is this going to be a panacea? How far will it go in terms of solving the burden of cross-organizational interoperability? And we don't know yet, but we're quite near the beginning of this era of mandated cross-organizational interoperability, and so it'll be interesting to see it unfold.
And I wrote down, I mean, I know when we were talking at the show and after, we mentioned hearing, key themes. Actually, before I say what I think the key themes, maybe that's a good question for us. What do you hear as the key themes at ViVe that landed on you?
Well, certainly, I can be biased, coming from Lineate in the space we're in, but I definitely recognize that interoperability was a key theme there. I mean, Michelle, you just mentioned some of the things you saw on the show floor, even with the Interop Now exhibits, and then the open discussions there. I thought that those were just constantly well attended, had a lot of people there. They were constantly rotating speakers in two different places, and I found those to be quite easy to engage in. People were very welcomed in. It was basically a very intimate discussion, but anybody could participate. And I saw that people were frequently gathered around those sessions. And outside of the show floor, when you look at the actual discussions going on, there were so many topics about interoperability. And I went to a decent number of those, and a decent number that weren't on interoperability. And it was very apparent to me that the ones that had the interoperability topics, I mean, the room was absolutely filled with people. The other ones, were a little bit less densely populated with attendance, but the interoperability ones definitely got a lot of attention. And so, I look at it and think interoperability was a really big theme there. Security was a big theme. cybersecurity continues to be a big focus area within healthcare, and certainly the geopolitical situation now continues to put more stress into the healthcare system around cybersecurity. And so that clearly was a big theme that popped up. And then the third one that I would have highlighted, Michelle, is everyone had across the board been looking at the problem of burnout, employee burnout, essentially. And on the provider side is, looking at clinician burnout, being burned with trying to keep up with the volume of work for the pandemic. And essentially, behind that, all of the IT staff required to help maintain the systems and set up all sorts of ad hoc new systems to support the alternative care pathways. So that was a really big trend that I heard as well, is how can IT help to reduce that burden or stress put on to all of the people participating in the provider community. So those are three I would highlight. I'd be interested to hear if you guys have other ones you would have added to that.
Yeah, Drew, what would you add?
Yeah, I agree that interoperability and cybersecurity are two things that are always relevant in healthcare. So it's no surprise that they were prominent again this year. Other than that, I mean, it's hard to identify a strong theme. Like it seems like, especially at HIMSS, it used to be the fun activity to walk through the exhibition hall and see what the buzzword was for that year, whether it was going to be population health management or predictive analytics. It seemed like every topic got its turn to be like the popular buzzword. And maybe I just overlooked it, but this year I didn't find like a common overarching theme. And maybe it's because some of those have been abstracted out, like we had the startup pavilion and cybersecurity pavilion. So some of those things that span across all the different exhibitors are now their own focus area, versus being something that everyone's trying to get, in front of everyone's attention with the signage on their booth.
That's a good thing to call out. What I was thinking, gosh, I feel for the end user buyers, the product managers of the world, the CIOs, the enterprise architects, because the messaging in some cases, it's like interoperability. And there's a question that just came in, and this is what I was thinking. There's so many variations around the theme of interoperability. And so, excuse me, what does that mean? And I heard sessions, I think Scott, you mentioned this too, about FHIR, like trying to understand the relevance of FHIR and how are we going to abandon HL7 and move to FHIR. I think people were asking that question. How widely adopted is FHIR? What's happening with API style integrations? Can I leverage the tools I've always been using, or do I need something new? How do they play together? Can I keep working with partners like Lineate that I've always worked with, or do I need to weave new things in? And then even patient identification surfaced, several times as part of interoperability. So I saw those as sort of variations around the theme of interoperability. How do we share information? And Drew, I don't want to steal your line, but tee it up, as you're always saying, interoperability is kind of moving target. It's always evolving, and I felt that to be very true this year. How would you talk about that?
Yeah, perhaps I'll leverage my 15-year tenure of attending HIMSS to kind of track how it's evolved over the years. I mean, interoperability has always been a theme at HIMSS, but the earliest one I remember was the struggle to adopt ICD-10 was kind of the first interoperability topic I remember, because providers want to get paid for their services, so in order to interoperate with payers, they needed to adopt ICD-10, and that took a long time to do. A few years after that, or maybe overlapping with that, the interoperability theme became, how do we participate with HIEs? Providers were concerned with being able to exchange data throughout a region, and the health information exchanges were being built in the 2008 to 2010 or 11 timeframe. So that was another flavor of interoperability that came and went. Today, I think the overarching idea of interoperability is okay, now the data is, in the electronic medical records, and it is by mandate. It's now, liquid data. It flows easily from place to place. And I think that's driving a lot of these digital startups, like you mentioned, the 500 startups. You can have the best idea in the world for a health and wellness management app, but it can't do anything unless you can get the patient data. And now that there's the promise that you can easily and uniformly get that patient data out of the EMR, that's driving a lot of activity in the startup space. And so that's kind of the flavor of interoperability we're seeing today, is the EMR to patient app interoperability. And along with that comes things like FHIR and APIs and everything else. So that's sort of how I see the evolution, especially in the recent years.
Yeah, and Drew, you hit on the head with the the number of app developers. I mean, you have what I notice with interoperability right now is you have all of these there's a group of people who are advocating and trying to get the community excited about the capabilities that are demanded on certain stakeholders that come from the interoperability rulings, and making sure we get away from information blocking. And so you have people who are advocating and promoting all the benefits they're going to get from that. Then you have a whole bunch of new app developers, hundreds of them, thousands of them, quite honestly, is what the numbers I've seen. And everyone's trying to figure out, well, how do we get access to data? How do we participate in that environment? And so they're trying to learn that on the fly. And so I mentioned, listening to a session about FHIR in some of the interoperability rulings and TEFCA. And there was, I remember one of the panelists asking, well, how many people in this room, and it was a packed room, I mean, the entire room was filled. How many people in this room come from a provider? And only 2 people raised their hand. And so everybody else in there was a digital health application developer of some sort. And so it was really interesting to see, just everyone's trying to figure out, what is the way that they can participate, and it's really hard for them. And they're trying to find what they would consider the easy button. At the same time, the providers who weren't in that attendance as much at that discussion, they look at it and say they got these requests coming in every day. And how do we basically serve up the ability to get data out to these new applications? And they really can't keep up with that volume in those requests. And so that was a real common thread throughout all of this, is that this upshoot of the belief that more and more applications are going to take off because you're now going to provide consumers with more ability to access data through new applications is really driving that point that you're highlighting.
And I think that's there's another question from Scott Hall, actually, at Mercy Medical. He was asking, it sounds like he's talked to you recently, Drew, and he's kind of asking about the changes that are ahead for CorePoint and Rhapsody in light of the conversation that we're having right now. Scott, do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Well, I can certainly speak to. I mean, Drew, if you want to add anything, you can as well. So, from our perspective, we continue to. There's a couple different trends that we're focused on with regards to those key platforms that we have. One is that we will continue to help customers more easily implement FHIR-based workflows, and so we support FHIR-based workflows in both of those platforms today. But we will continue to make it easier and more automated in order to do that, and provide more user interface capabilities to simplify the task of building out these FHIR-based workflows. In addition to that, we focus a lot on how we can help with just broader API style of integrations. They don't have to be FHIR. I heard some people at the conference reference again that FHIR is great. But with any standard, it's the best of the weakest points, maybe from everyone's different perspectives. And so sometimes standards can be lagging, obviously, to what you can provide in a technology solution. So I heard people still saying that there's a lot of places where they need to go beyond what's in the FHIR APIs today and still need to have proprietary APIs. And so we look at how do we help people, not just with FHIR, but how do they do any sort of API style integration? How do they manage all of the complexity and the security and the gatewaying required around those style of integrations? So a lot in that area, Scott. The other thing that we focus on is really around how to help customers get their solutions, their interoperability outside of the four walls of their organization, and to really be living in more of the, what we'll say, the cloud environment. And so a lot of efforts we are putting in to help enable customers to either deploy their solutions and securely transmit data through the cloud on our platforms, or in some cases, we are actually helping customers by taking on some of those responsibilities. To answer your question, Scott, with a fully managed service, I think those are two things I will highlight specifically to the point we just made. And the last one I'll bring up is that we recently announced the merger of Nextgate, and so really better tying together the identification of patient data and making sure that it's associated with the right unique individual is another key area that we're focusing on in our platforms today. Drew, anything that you would have added that I just kind of that you think would be real important to the points that we're highlighting?
No, when the question came up, I jotted down my top 5 points, and then you stole them all. But that last one about Nextgate is really important because maybe not everyone heard the news that Lineate has merged with Nextgate, and so I know the question was about Rhapsody and CorePoint, but we're no longer just the company that does Rhapsody and CorePoint. We are on a mission to build a suite of interoperability tools, and Nextgate is a perfect addition to that. And as it pertains to Rhapsody and CorePoint, we're delivering pre-built connectors that can be installed in the Rhapsody and CorePoint engines to automatically take advantage of the Nextgate functionality. So that is something that will be coming in Rhapsody and CorePoint that's impacted by the Nextgate merger.
It's good. You two are always so in sync, so I'm not surprised. It was whoever went first was going to, steal the.
It's almost like we work on the same team. Yeah.
It's like it's good alignment, right? Feels nice. I was gonna move us north and talk about HIMSS a little bit, but before we do that, I know at the end we'll wrap up kind of a summary of what we think about the events. For anybody who's sort of thinking, there was a lot of options of where to participate at the show, and we participated in the Interop Now Pavilion. Scott attended Chime, like you mentioned, and we had a booth, and I felt like that gave us really good coverage to speak with HIEs, people representing public health that were there, provider organizations, healthcare IT of all sizes, startups, and legacy companies. And so we had a really good broad representation across the show floor. And that was a nice way to do it for the inaugural year of the event, to sort of capture who all of the different audiences were there. There was a question that came in and asked about startups and HIEs, and I did interact with kind of with all of the above. I heard that the focus groups on day one were heavily provider centric, so that was nice. And then definitely it's hard to be at any show now and not talk to other digital health solutions. They're so dominant, I guess. There's so many problems to be solved, and really, to your point about application developers, the tools are within reach to figure out innovative ways to solve healthcare. That I definitely felt digital health folks were all around and affecting the whole landscape of the interoperability space, because they're trying to get access to data. Providers are under pressure to supply this data, and just creating more necessity and more need to share data in a simpler way, like you were outlining, Scott. So that's kind of what I saw in terms of where to exhibit or where to be at the show. Okay, so all of us are in cold places, so it was nice to start to get to Florida.
Oh, it was warm, yeah, it was great. Yeah. Except for a great rain shower one of the nights when I was walking to dinner. It was wonderful weather.
Yeah, it was pouring. Okay, so then we headed north. Well, Drew and I headed north, and Scott, you went way north back home, and went to Orlando to check out HIMSS and kind of first impressions of HIMSS, Drew, when you got there relative to ViVe.
Yeah, so I mean, we were talking about this like leading up to the two conferences. It was the first year for ViVe, and HIMSS has obviously been around for a really long time, and we knew that we're going to have the opportunity to compare and contrast the two since they were so close in geography as well as in time. And so having them back to back like that really provided an easy way to compare them. I think that, we already talked about how ViVe feels new and fresh. And the question was going to be, will that make HIMSS seem old and, no longer relevant? And I think when we got to HIMSS, the answer was that it's not. It's still the same old HIMSS. It's the place to be. Everyone was there. I mean, I know attendance was down, but it still felt like a big show where attendance was pretty much everybody in the industry was there. So, a lot of the normal HIMSS stuff went on in terms of reconnecting with people that you had worked with in the past, and seeing all the different vendors from across the whole space. So it felt very much like a normal HIMSS, and people were happy to be there because even though there was just one in August in Las Vegas, this felt like the real HIMSS of the year. And everyone was brought the usual energy to it. So I think in the end, both shows have different focus and a different different spirit, but both are still highly relevant, and it's good to see them both thriving in this environment.
Yeah, I had a similar reaction. I think I thought, oh, we're just going to have ViVe from now on. And then, and then when I was heading to HIMSS, I thought, it's going to be so different. And yet got there and it felt really familiar. And then, like you said, running into former colleagues you've worked with over the years, it felt really familiar. And the audience was different. Like I didn't run into a lot of the same people from ViVe to HIMSS, customer wise or vendor, provider wise or vendor wise. And I found the conversations had similar threads around interoperability and cybersecurity. But, I will say at HIMSS, I talked to more current customers, like people who are using Lineate solutions. And I don't know why that is necessarily, but I found myself talking to a lot of Rhapsody customers and CorePoint customers, NextGate customers about how they're using the technology. And so that was fun for me to have that familiarity. So I left like agreeing with you. Like I would do both. I would see a space for both shows in the future.
Yeah, I'm glad we exhibited at both rather than choosing one or the other. I know a lot of vendors and a lot of attendees were choosing one or the other and trying to decide beforehand, which was going to be the right one to go to. So I think that it was right to do both.
I have more serious questions for us, but we're always talking about all the facets of the show. And I did notice specifically at HIMSS, and Scott, I think this is true at ViVe a little bit lesser degree though, there were so many coffee stations this year. And I felt I had to try an AWS cappuccino, Keurig at the clinical architecture booth. I think I may have drank more coffee during HIMSS than I do at home, and that's saying a lot. I'm from Seattle. Did either of you have that experience too?
I definitely did.
Yeah, exactly. And go ahead, Drew. I mean,
no, you.
I'm not a coffee drinker per se, so I'm much more of a tea guy. But when you look at the ViVe conference, they essentially always would have break sessions, and there was always beverages set up, coffees and teas, and then all the booths also had baristas and things. And so it's definitely mainstream there. You could get anything you wanted at any time, basically.
Yeah. I mean, this might be a minor point, but I do think people think about this. At HIMSS, I end up being really hungry during the days. I don't get a lunch break, and at ViVe there was a lunch, and I felt like we were able to make space for people to eat more often. But then at HIMSS, everyone had a coffee bar, so that scratched the itch a little bit. Drew?
That's actually a good point. At ViVe and also at Health, this is something they share in common, is like the meals are part of the event. You know, it's included, so you don't have to like stand in a long line and pay way too much for a burrito or something. You go to the meal as part of the event, and you know, a lot of the interesting interactions happen at the breakfast and lunch tables. I think that happened for sure. It happened at Health, and I think it happened at ViVe too. The other nice thing about the the always available coffee is it does avoid those lines, because in the past, you know, you've had the situation where the line at Starbucks is a mile and a half long and takes you an hour to get through it. So that was a nice plus.
Yeah, I agree. That was nice. All right, let's talk about conversations a little bit at HIMSS and what was top of mind. Did you find, Drew, that TEFCA, evolving interoperability, kind of same topics as ViVe, or how would you compare and contrast your conversation?
Yeah, I think that I guess I should mention that I spent most of my time in meetings with other vendors, because my focus is on partnerships and the industry. So I spent a lot of time with our peers in the industry, and so I got their perspective on these things. And you know, for the most part, I think that the vendors have accepted TEFCA and the ONC and CMS rules as part of the landscape. They have plans to, you know, they've built it into their plans. They know what it means for them and how they intend to use it, all of that stuff. I think that on the provider side and on the you know, the consumer side, I think it's still a little bit unproven what those things are going to mean. Like, what will be the full potential of the ONC and CMS rules mandating FHIR access to data? What will TEFCA end up looking like? We don't quite know yet, but you know, each company out there seems to have an opinion on what that will mean, and they've baked it into their plans of their, you know, next 4 quarters of software releases and go-to-market plans. So I think that you know, based on what I saw among the vendors out there, I think there's a lot of readiness, and I think that you know, in the next 12 months, we're going to see a lot of energy behind the regulatory side of interoperability, really realizing what the potential is there.
I like thinking about you talking with all these partners, because I think you know, a natural outfall of that is that we're going to make connecting with them even easier, right? And just when you're talking, I'm thinking, gosh, all the providers, they're faced with so many vendor solutions, and they're probably thinking, yeah, it's awesome, but how do we onboard them faster? Scott, you mentioned the you know, staff shortage, like less resources, more demand. And I was just going to pose, you know, gosh, if our customers have questions about how do they integrate these new applications into their environment, obviously we'd encourage them to reach out and we can have those conversations. But part of what you were talking about earlier, Scott, around simplification is, you know, in line with what Drew was saying, right? Part of making that simpler is easing those connections and helping our customers think through those architectures.
Yeah, right. And the thing is, if interoperability was easy, we probably wouldn't be talking about it all the time. And the reality is, in healthcare, there's just so much data that has been generated over the years, and with each additional new system, whether it's a device or a new application, there's more data being generated or consumed. Even, you know, think of your IoT, your you know, your smartwatch is generating all sorts of health data now, and so you just have so much more data that you're dealing with, and trying to make sense out of that data and trying to figure out how that data plays into the workflows you have, and where it makes sense to expose that data to the different end users. There's a lot of complexity to that. And so, you know, the reality is, like, you can connect 2 systems up and say, you know, you can get them networked together, but trying to understand the context and the goals of what you're trying to accomplish, that takes a bit of discussion. And, you know, that's where we find that a lot of these organizations, a lot of the smaller digital health companies, even very mature companies, come to us and ask us to help navigate those discussions, because there's a whole series of different considerations that need to go through and try to find answers to, in order to make sure you can architect and to build a solution that's going to make sense. And so, unfortunately, I don't think that there's always an easy button. There's certainly things we do to make it much more simple. Once you know what you need to get done, we focus on building tools to enable that. But that discovery session is so important that we have with customers, to really talk through and make sure we understand the workflows and the data requirements to ensure that we get the right solution for them.
Drew?
Yeah, along those lines, I think the conversations are getting more nuanced, because it used to go something like this. A healthcare IT vendor would come to us and say, we have this great solution for bending the curve of healthcare costs, and all we need is the data out of the EMR. And our response would be, yeah, you probably do. That's 100% of the problem. The functionality you build is almost a side effect of getting that data. And then they would turn around and say, okay, so we need the EMR data, give it to us. And that gives us very little room to operate when the mandate is so broad as that. Today, though, I think we're seeing much more sophisticated questions coming from the healthcare IT and digital health vendors. They're asking specific questions about access to specific types of data in specific ways for specific use cases, right? The question is, now I have a digital health app to increase patient engagement, and they have their whole business plan modeled out, and they know exactly what data they need, and they have an idea of how to get to it, and then they just need the help of someone who's done it before, and the right tooling. So I think what this shows is that over 10 plus years of working on interoperability, the word has gotten out of what it means and what it enables, and it's now becoming less of a feature that vendors are trying to bolt onto their product, and more of a core piece of their functionality that drives the rest of their functionality. And that's an exciting transformation to see, even though it took so long. That it's been a long time coming, but I think now that we're getting there, it's really exciting, because once that's fully internalized, we can take the next step and build some really cool solutions to these problems.
Yeah, that makes me happy just thinking about it. And it also segue to this kind of final question that we got from the audience, was about the Nextgate merger. And we just popped up a sign at the show announcing the merger with Nextgate, when one of our customers walked by, and he stops and is standing in front of the sign, hi, nice to see you, how are you doing? And he goes, I need a master person index. And so, speaking of needs evolving, what his organization has seen is that they thought they had solved this problem with their electronic medical record and the registration system, and then through a variety of growth, both organically and inorganically, they have realized they have a serious identity problem, where they can't simply simplify the reconciliation of these identities across systems, and the number of systems keeps multiplying and multiplying. And so while they didn't used to have a requirement for it, they do now have a requirement for it. And so, a sort of serendipitous timing that he walked by when we had just popped this up, and really echo the point that you're just making about how interoperability, it's gotten easier to say as it's gotten more foundational, and it's so much more obvious. So that was probably my biggest takeaway from both of the shows, as I've been feeling that through the pandemic, that interoperability has really been having its day. Everyone's realizing the need to information share, and then these shows further left me feeling that way. So maybe that's a good segue to closing comments. When Drew, Scott, anything?
Yeah, sure. I thought it was interesting. We're talking a lot about some of the new ONC and CMS interoperability rulings, and all of the trends towards using maybe FHIR-based APIs. And what I definitely found interesting at the event was that, although people see there's a lot of interesting use cases for these FHIR-based workflows, there was definitely a consistent trend about, okay, don't redo everything. And this was, everyone from digital health companies to providers to quite honestly, the government agencies saying, hey, there's all these workflows that are built up in integrations. You don't need to rebuild all those. That's not the purpose with, with these rulings. And so there's a series of new workflows that aren't well, that aren't well suited for maybe the traditional HL7v2 transactional message model. And that's where we really want to focus. And that, that gets into places like the app building or into trying to get data to the consumers or trying to get data across some of the different traditional organizational boundaries. And so I thought that was interesting because people always ask that question, hey, is HL7v2 going to go away? And it was very clear, no one thinks that it's going to, and it's very clear that no one thinks that's a good idea to try to replace all of those things. I think one thing I wanted to maybe throw to Drew, one observation I also heard was, people look at these rulings and, oh yeah, it's going to be great because we have all these requirements coming in and we need to go and implement APIs. There's no information blocking. And yet what I heard still behind that on the government side was, this kind of, they're trying to promote, get people excited about it, but behind it, they're also saying, don't do the minimal compliance because minimal compliance means future regulation.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of curious as to your thought on that point because I think we see these steps. We've gone through how many steps for meaningful use, and you go down these and you start with something, and then everyone starts to realize, well, that's not sufficient, and you realize you need something further. And I was kind of hoping maybe you could add a little bit on to that before we close out.
Yeah, minimal compliance is how we got to the place we are today. Because I think the original intent of the Meaningful Use program back in 2009 or whenever it started was let's get healthcare records off of paper and into a digital format. I think there was a baked-in assumption that by making it digital, that would make it interoperable because you have almost no chance of interoperability on paper. But once it's computerized, I mean, computers share data all the time. So I think that was a built-in assumption. There were some minimal requirements in the Meaningful Use program to be able to exchange data, but there was no requirement to do it like at scale because I think it was just assumed that the concept would catch on and the interoperability would happen, and then it didn't, which is why they had to come back with the rules from CMS and ONC to about information blocking. To compel vendors to enable the features and data holders to be able to share it. I mean, it took 10 years or something like that, right? I mean, if Meaningful Use came out in 2009, 21st Century Cures Act came out in 2016, and then it took another 2 or 2.5 years for the law to turn into concrete, actionable rules with deadlines. So. That's a great point, which is if we don't want to go through another decade of minimal compliance followed by another upheaval of regulation, then it's best to think about all the potential and start implementing it now, which is what the smart organizations are doing anyway. Anytime there's a compliance directive, if you treat it as a burden and do the minimum, then you'll be compliant and you can stay in business. But when you really figure out like what's the intention of the regulation, what benefits does it enable, and then try to take advantage of all those, you'll go beyond the minimum, and so you'll do more work, but you'll be so much more ahead of those who just did the minimum that you'll be out front for a long time. So I think that's what we're seeing out there, is that there is this bifurcation of those who are trying to do the minimum and those who are trying to build a strategy around the new capabilities implied by the regulations.
And I think when you build that strategy, like the first thing I was thinking when you were talking about meaningful use is, can you imagine if they tried to architect it for scale at the beginning? Like just the idea would have been very overwhelming. Like in anything like this, you sort of have to be able to move in bite-sized chunks. And so strategy can be so overwhelming if you try to think, how much will this have to scale? How do I build for that? And maybe a stepwise approach to that is, let me put a foundation in place, knowing it's going to evolve, but something that is tools that are strong and able to evolve. I suppose having a partner that you know is going to respond with agility more than figuring out the right answer for 10 years from now. It's like an answer that will scale or evolve.
Yeah, and I mean, the regulations, if you read back to them historically, you'll find that like an API-based framework for healthcare technology was envisioned very early on. But, you know, obviously meaningful use couldn't say everyone has to implement APIs because their data was still on paper, right? So they had to do exactly that. They had to take it in stages. And the first stage was get it off of paper into an electronic medical record. And then they had to answer the question, what is an electronic medical record? That's what the meaningful use program was about, was meaningful use of a certified EHR technology. They certified the EHR technology, which was basically defining what is an electronic health record, and that then led to what types of data will we be exchanging when APIs are possible.
Yeah, get yourself a great architect. Think about that. This is a good discussion. I mean, I think for the audience, we're trying to start the discussion. It's fun to attend these events back to back. I'm glad everyone's, you know, feeling well. We didn't talk about the obvious, the COVID, you know, scenario, and most of us escaped unscathed. A couple of colds coming out of the event, but nothing too serious. And so I want to start the conversation, start this discussion. If people have more questions about HIMSS or ViVe, we'd love to hear from you. And it was really great to see everybody at the shows, and thanks to all the healthcare workers and being able to see some of you again in person. And I think that's it. Yeah, have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.